Nitocris, the Queen of Vengeance, last pharaoh of the 6th dynasty, and one of FGO's most endearing goofballs. By looking into her class, design, skill set, backstory, and characterization, how well does the Nitocris of Fate Grand Order compare to her historical and literary counterpart? And what grade would I give her depiction? Let's find out, shall we? Nitocris is a caster and Avenger class servant, which, well, this is going to take a little unpacking, because Nitocris isn't quite as straightforward as she seems. Let's give a quick primer. Nitocris is the last pharaoh of the 6th dynasty, who took over the throne from her brother, who was also her husband because ancient Egyptian royalty was huge into incest. Her brother was murdered. Nitocris was put on the throne by the people who did it, only for her to get revenge by killing everyone involved in her brother's murder. After this, she then took her own life, either out of guilt for her behavior or to escape further retribution. Now based on that, Avenger makes sense to a degree, undercut by the fact that she offed herself afterwards. But if Avenger doesn't work, then perhaps Assassin might, which is actually what we get with Summer Nitocris. Avenger and Assassin makes sense. So why is she a caster? Well, there's actually a short story in the Cthulhu mythos of all things, called The Mirror of Nitocris by Brian Lumley, part of a book of short stories called The Caller of the Black. In this story, an archaeologist discovers a mirror reportedly belonging to Nitocris, a cursed mirror that can unleash death upon those who come into contact with it. Sound familiar? It should, because that's exactly what caster Nitocris' MP is. So, the main Nitocris in FGO is a caster, but this is a blend of the original historical figure and also elements from a short story released in 1971. On another note, I find it funny how, in a game that has the Foreigner class full of characters who have made connections with the outer gods of the Cthulhu mythos, Nitocris, a character who actually is mentioned in the Cthulhu mythos, doesn't have a Foreigner version. How odd. Anyway, as far as the original Nitocris goes, Assassin or Avenger would be the best choices. Choices we get in her Summer and Alter forms. Caster, I guess it works, but only for the literary version. Though speaking of Nitocris' Alter form, there is much more going on here. It's not just Nitocris herself, but she is being heavily influenced by the Egyptian god Anubis, to the point that she almost seems like a pseudo-servant of Anubis. We'll be talking more about this throughout the video, but a note about Anubis? He is one of the most well-known of the Egyptian gods, despite the fact that he's only in charge of judging the souls of the dead, guarding graveyards, and funeral rites. But since all of these things involve death or the afterlife, depictions of Anubis are plentiful in the remains of ancient Egypt that we are most familiar with, their tombs. So for that reason, despite his domain being relatively modest compared to something like the sun or the sky, Anubis is one of the most recognizable figures from the Egyptian pantheon. Getting into her character design, it's quite clear that Nitocris is meant to be from ancient Egypt. First, she's wearing a weseg around her neck, that traditional necklace collar thing. And while she isn't wearing the nemes, the headdress thing you so often see on pharaohs, her hair vaguely resembles one, especially in her third ascension when it gets those golden stripes. And she is tanned, which is more than we can say for other servants from the region, though ironically in the writings of the Egyptian priest Manetho, she's actually described as fair-skinned. But while Nitocris might be dressed in much less clothing than she probably should be, she at least looks Egyptian. As for the ears, they closely resemble those found on the god Anubis, who judges the souls of the dead to determine whether or not they were worthy to head to Aru, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of heaven. Since Nitocris in Fate mixes both her historical and Lovecraftian version, and so gets a closer connection to death, and by extension Anubis, I guess they decided to give her these ears to further emphasize that. And for Nitocris Alter, her connection to Anubis goes from subtle to she basically is Anubis now. She also puts on more clothes, looking much more Egyptian, and also very ominous. Now, I should probably come clean about bias here. Nitocris Alter? I think this is one of the coolest designs the Fate artists have ever come up with. I rolled a copy of her in no small part because of it, even if my Avenger AoE arts looping needs are well covered by the likes of Space Ishtar and Summer Kama. Hell, I even grailed Space Ishtar to 100, and I used her quite a lot. Anyway, if I sound like I'm gushing over Nito Alter's design, I totally am. But really, it is also an objectively good design. Her first ascension has her vaguely resembling a mummy, with her being wrapped up in bandages, even as her body underneath is made of that blue flame stuff due to how unstable her spirit origin is. Her second ascension features a large animal that resembles Anubis, while the third gives her those giant scales, like the scales Anubis uses to judge the souls of the dead. As for the wings, that links to the god Horus, who is often depicted as a falcon. I'll talk more about him soon. Overall, both forms of Nitocris have clear, definite links to her Egyptian heritage, the gods she is connected to, and her role as a pharaoh. They're both good, but between the two, I'd say Nito Altar has the better design, but that may just be my own bias at play. Moving into her skill set, we're going to start with Caster Nitocris. Caster Nitocris' first skill is Egyptian Magecraft, which becomes Works of the Underworld God after an upgrade. Egyptian Magecraft is kinda self-explanatory, a skill denoting magic specific to ancient Egypt, with a particular emphasis on necromancy. This is further emphasized in the upgrade, Works of the Underworld God. Though, I should probably clarify that while the god Anubis is linked to Nitocris, especially her altar form, and that Anubis is closely connected to the afterlife due to his role as the Judge of Souls, he is not actually the god of the underworld. I mean, he used to be. He was the god of the underworld in the time when Nitocris was alive, and so that fits well. But later on, during the Middle Kingdom era, from roughly 2000 to 1700 BCE, Anubis was replaced by Osiris as the god of the underworld, instead becoming this Judger of Souls guy. I just thought I'd clarify that. Anyway, Nitocris being a wielder of magic is more linked to her Lovecraft version rather than her historical version, so I'm kinda mixed on it. I mean, it's not totally wrong, but if you look at Nitocris' profile, both her normal and altar forms, it says that the origin is history, not the short story The Mirror of Nitocris. I don't know if that's an omission by the developers, or do they really think that historical Nitocris was some kind of mage queen necromancer? This is something that's going to come up again and again throughout this video, so I thought I'd get it out of the way now, and then refer back to it so I don't have to say it a dozen times. Nitocris' second skill is Rapid Words of Divine, the special skill wielded by magic users from the Age of Gods, which we last saw on Medea, and will later see on Circe and Hephaestion. What I just said about Nitocris wielding magic applies here. It works for the Lovecraft version, but not so much the historical version. Nitocris' third skill is Affection of the Sky God, a reference to the Egyptian god of the sky, Horus. In FGO, Nitocris is said to be the child of the god Horus, as well as his incarnation. In the Old Kingdom period of Egypt, the pharaohs were said to be the incarnations of Horus, that they were the god inhabiting a mortal's body. As the last pharaoh of the 6th dynasty, the last dynasty of the Old Kingdom period, Nitocris would have been seen as being Horus herself, not a child of Horus. So while the link to Horus is a good one for Nitocris, they do screw it up a little. Shifting to her altar form, Nitocris Altar's first skill is Elegiac Text, which I don't have the foggiest idea what this is supposed to be. Her profile doesn't address this skill at all. The FGO wiki gives it a rough translation of funeral records, which, okay, now we might be onto something, since the god Anubis, who is an even bigger presence for Nitocris Altar than for the original, is the god connected to funeral rites, in addition to being a guardian of graves and the judger of souls. Obviously, this has very strong links to Anubis, but less so to Nitocris herself. Nito Altar's second skill is God of the Underworld's Judgment, referring to that bit I mentioned before, about how the god Anubis would weigh the souls of the dead upon his scales, and from there determine whether or not they were worthy of continuing on their journey. Like the previous skill, this clearly has more to do with Anubis than Nitocris. Lastly, Nitocris Altar's third skill is Desert Night Breeze, which is actually a variation of the skill Imperial Privilege specific to Nitocris. Brief as it was, Nitocris did rule Egypt as its queen for about 3 years, the first woman to ever do so. She might very well be one of, if not the, oldest ruling queens in history. Though, there is some debate over whether or not Nitocris really existed. Was she a true pharaoh, or a Greek mistranslation of another pharaoh's name? This other pharaoh is named Netjekare Sipta, whereas Nitocris' Egyptian name is Nitikreti. There are some who think these two are actually the same person, that Nitocris was actually a male pharaoh. But we are talking about someone who lived over 4,000 years ago. We're lucky to have any records at all from back then, and so we will probably never get a definitive answer to this. Caster Nitocris' noble phantasm is Anpu Nebta Jzer, whereupon she unleashes the power of the Mir. The god Anubis appears, and her enemies are assailed by a flurry of spirits from the afterlife. The name roughly translates to Anubis, Lord of the Sacred Land, referring to Anubis' role as the guardian of graves. Much like how Nitocris is a Greek version of the name Nitikreti, Anubis is a Greek version of the name Ampu. Anyway, while the name itself relates to another one of Anubis' roles as a god, the imagery of this MP is obviously a reference to that whole Mirror of Nitocris thing from the Lovecraft story, rather than having anything to do with the actual historical figure. Hilariously enough, if you wanted to find a solid, lore-accurate MP for Nitocris, you would actually be looking at her Summer Version's MP, Sneferu Teru Nile. This depicts how Nitocris carried out her revenge, by gathering her enemies into a chamber, presumably for a banquet, only to let in the waters of the Nile, drowning them all. Since this is the most famous thing Nitocris ever did, it's the perfect choice for her MP. I wish we had gotten this for her main version rather than her summer version, but at least it's somewhere in the game. On another note, I think this might be the first time I've directly mentioned a summer version's MP in relation to a character's actual lore. Most of the time, summer versions are comedic, with only a few loose links to the original character, which is why I tend to ignore them for these videos. However, there are some characters who have really cool lore connections in their summer versions, notably Katsushika Hokusai, Miyamoto Musashi, and, of course, Nitocris. Anyway, those are the MPs for Nitocris' caster and summer forms. Now, what about her altar form?
罪に罰を死には導きをああその罪計り知らず我が連れて行こう彼方へ
Nitocris Altar's MP is Neferu Swen Anubis, whereupon she summons the Egyptian underworld, creates a massive avatar of the god Anubis, and then forces her enemies to endure his judgment. Notably, it says in Nito Altar's profile that all the hieroglyphics that feature in this MP's animation, those are actually prayers from her ancestors, fellow pharaohs of the 6th dynasty, made so that Nitocris herself doesn't get consumed by the power of Anubis' judgment. Now, aside from me saying that I think this is one of the coolest MP animations in all of FGO, there isn't much I can say about this MP that I haven't said already. That this is Nitocris wielding the power of the god Anubis. And with how much symbolism is in her design, as well as having 2 of her 3 skills be directly connected to the god, this is why I said earlier that Nito Altar is like a pseudo-servant of Anubis. That's not quite what's going on, but if it was, this would be a great MP choice for him. Nitocris' craft essence is Unused Royal Authority, depicting Nitocris' staff and the god Anubis in front of an old mural. The C's text gives us a better clue. It's Nitocris talking about her past, how she was placed upon the throne as a puppet after her brother's murder. She felt outraged not only by her brother's murder, but also by the disdain these people had for the gods, that they would dare harm a pharaoh, the very incarnation of the god Horus. And so it was for those reasons that Nitocris had them all killed. But because of that, she also admits that she has a bit of a short fuse, and asks for your understanding. Or rather, in typical Nitocris fashion, she demands it, playing into her characterization of trying to be a stuffy monarch who demands respect, but often coming off as a huge dork. A very fun and likable dork. Nitocris Altar's craft essence is Amit, depicting a scary-looking monster standing in a pool. We see this creature in Nitocris Altar's arts card attacks in her 3rd ascension. But what is it? Well, Amit is a creature that is a mix of a crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus, and it plays a key role alongside the god Anubis. So remember how I've mentioned how Anubis judges the souls of the dead? Well, how that would work is that Anubis would take the person's heart, put it on his scale, and weigh it against the feather of Mat, another Egyptian goddess. If a person has lived a good life, then the heart would match the weight of the feather, letting them continue on their journey to Aru in an audience with the god Osiris. But if the heart was heavier than the feather, that the person had sinned, their heart would be eaten by Amit, destroying their soul. So again, another solid link to Anubis, rather than Nitocris herself. Nitocris' Valentines Sea is Blessing of the Nile, depicting some chocolate pyramids on a plate, surrounded by Medjeds. Medjed is something that comes up regularly with Fate's Nitocris, especially since she dresses up as Medjed in her summer form's first ascension. So what is this thing? Well, Medjed is another Egyptian god that we actually know next to nothing about. He is mentioned in a single line in the Book of the Dead, where he is referred to as the Smiter. That's what the name Medjed means. For all we know, he could have had a completely different name, but this is what we have. Since Medjed is linked to Osiris, we know he has something to do with death or the afterlife, but that's about it. Well, also that he can shoot beams from his eyes. Beware. But because Medjed's design is very silly, he became an internet sensation in Japan, which is probably why they tossed him in together with Nitocris, another ancient Egyptian figure we don't know much about. But while Medjed's link to Nitocris is an invention of the Fate franchise, they are sorta connected, since Fate's Nitocris is also tied to her Lovecraft version, and by extension the Underworld, Anubis, Ammit, and Medjed. Nitocris Altar's Valentines C is What's This?, depicting a white feather upon a plate, with Anubis and some Medjeds looking on. Nito Altar's Bond C refers to the beast Ammit, part of Anubis's role as the Judge of Souls. Well, if you remember what I said about that, then this C's meaning should be pretty obvious. It is the feather of Mat, what was weighed against the hearts of the dead when Anubis judged their souls. As for the C's text, Nitocris Altar says that now is the time to test your courage. Meaning, is it time for the protagonist to face the judgment of Anubis? Yikes. And now for characterization, starting with a look into the legends surrounding Nitocris. So as I mentioned earlier, Nitocris was the last pharaoh of Egypt's 6th dynasty, the last dynasty of Egypt's Old Kingdom period, a time of great upheaval as the power of Egypt's pharaohs was being supplanted by the nobility. Exact dates for this far back are sketchy, but it is said that Nitocris reigned from about 2213 to 2210 BCE, or possibly from between the years 2184 to 2181 BCE. Yeah, Nitocris is old. Really old. Over 4,000 years old. There are very few servants who are older. This actually gave me a video idea about making a montage of all the FGO servants, together with their name and the dates at which they were alive, or when their legend is believed to have taken place, all sorted chronologically. Alas, this idea is a bit harder than I thought, because while it's easy to find dates for the lives of historical figures, when it comes to legends and divinities, that is much, much harder. Arash, for example, doesn't seem to have any time where he's said to be from, only that it was a long time ago. I haven't abandoned the idea of making a video like that, but well, it's not as straightforward as you might think. Anyway, back to Nitocris. As I mentioned earlier, there is some debate about whether or not Nitocris actually existed, or if she is a result of the mistranslation of some other pharaoh's name. We have two sources for Nitocris, the Greek historian Herodotus from the 5th century BCE, and an Egyptian priest named Manetho from the 3rd century BCE. It is Herodotus' account that is the most famous, which makes sense since he is sometimes called the father of history. But the amount he wrote about Nitocris is very short, being little more than a paragraph. It says that Nitocris' brother had been killed by his own people, who then put Nitocris upon the throne as a puppet. But Nitocris was understandably less than pleased about her brother being murdered, who was also her husband. Egyptian royalty was huge into incest, which sorta makes sense if you remember that the pharaoh is supposed to be the incarnation of Horus. You don't want to mix divine blood with lesser beings, like humans. Anyway, Nitocris ruled for a few years, playing the good puppet for the people who had killed her brother, all the while building a secret underground chamber for her plan. When it was ready, Nitocris threw a banquet, inviting everyone she knew who had a hand in the murder of her brother. Once they were all there, Nitocris sprung her trap, letting the waters of the Nile into the underground chamber, drowning everyone inside. After this, Nitocris then took her own life, heading into another chamber and throwing herself upon a fire, presumably to avoid any retribution from anyone who might have survived. That is literally all we know about the historical Nitocris. But since Nitocris is like 1,500 years older than the city of Rome, it's lucky that we have anything at all, especially in a country with a history like Egypt. They may have some phenomenal land around the Nile, but that in turn is surrounded by deserts. There's nowhere to go. It's one of the reasons why Egypt, though it was rich and powerful, usually ended up being the one conquered rather than doing the conquering. Despite the fact that our knowledge of Nitocris can be summarized in a paragraph, her story has endured for millennia, and it makes sense. A young puppet queen put upon the throne by people who killed her brother, only to turn the tables and get revenge? That would make for a great movie, albeit one with a downer ending. But while I don't know of any Nitocris movies, there are plenty of other works either about or involving her in some way. Most of them are retellings of her story, bringing history to a new audience. But then we have those two Lovecraft stories. Not only The Mirror of Nitocris by Brian Lumley, but also two short stories by H.P. Lovecraft himself, The Outsider and Imprisoned with the Pharaohs. Nitocris' involvement in these stories is rather tiny, giving her links to supernatural things like ghouls, evil spirits, and the titular mirror. Generally speaking, when Nitocris appears in fiction, she is portrayed as either this malevolent necromancer in the Cthulhu mythos, or as a fearsome instrument of vengeance, like Dantes or Kriemhild. What the real Nitocris was like, we don't know. Again, we are lucky that we know her story at all. Because of that, writers who have added Nitocris to their stories try to expand upon that, to create a character from what little information we do have about her. So how does Fate Grand Order decide to portray Nitocris? Well, what we get is a quirky young pharaoh who is simultaneously insistent upon others respecting her authority, while at the same time not feeling entirely worthy of her fellow pharaohs. This is best seen in her interlude, where she joins a gathering of her fellow pharaohs in Chaldea, but hangs back due to her feeling that she doesn't really belong among them. Because compared to the likes of Ozymandias, Alexander the Great, and Cleopatra, Nitocris feels she isn't worthy of such company. Considering that those are some serious heavy hitters, Nitocris feeling inadequate makes sense. But the three other pharaohs do their best to cheer Nitocris up, arranging a fight in the simulator that, together with the protagonist, Nitocris wins. It's a nice moment for her, and one that makes sense considering how small Nitocris' presence is in the historical record. But aside from that interlude, while Nitocris has many appearances, in Camelot, Summer 2, Halloween 2, and other events, for the longest time, she was a bit lacking in serious story content. Sure, Camelot was a real story, and while Nitocris was certainly memorable there, to me, the plot with her and Ozymandias felt like a sideshow compared to what was happening with the Round Table Knights. It was still a good introduction, giving us a good glimpse of her character, and Nitocris certainly became a very popular character afterwards. But when it comes to actually digging into her backstory, giving her a story moment for herself rather than just being attached to someone else's story, not so much. There are a few references to her backstory here and there, but for years, Nitocris was mostly just a fun goofball who popped up in events to make us laugh. All of that changed with the release of Lostbelt 7, Nahui Mictlan. Nitocris is the first of 4 allied servants Chaldea prepares in advance, and is the only one that you actually know about prior to meeting them in the underworld layers. It does make sense for Nitocris to be among these allied servants, since Mictlan is the name of the Aztec underworld, and Nitocris, thanks to being a blend of her historical and literary versions, her links to the underworld are strong. As for her part in Lostbelt 7, Nitocris has 2 major plot lines involving 2 of the new characters we meet there, Tenochtitlan and Camazotz. Nitocris developed a rivalry of sorts with Tenochtitlan, since they kept facing off against each other throughout Lostbelt 7. Admittedly, this storyline is more for the benefit of Tenochtitlan than Nitocris, since it is through their repeated encounters that Nitocris gradually figures out what Tenochtitlan's true identity is, first through some hints here and there, and then wielding the power of Anubis after she transforms into Nitocris Alter. While their relationship starts off quite hostile, with Tenochtitlan mocking Nitocris as she repeatedly tries and fails to hold off her assaults upon Chaldea, after Nitocris defeats Tenochtitlan, it is Nitocris who persuades her to switch sides, to choose to protect her city and her people, rather than continuing to go along with David and Tezcatlipoca's plan to awaken Ort. The much more interesting relationship Nitocris has is with Camazotz. Their encounters expose the true depths of Camazotz's character, revealing his backstory, his motivations, and ultimately how to defeat him. As the great terror of the 7th Lostbelt, Camazotz inspired fear in everyone he came across. They could do little more than hide and hope that this crazy bat monster would just pass them by. But when he came up against Nitocris, not only his superior as a necromancer, but also someone who could look to her past and honor the memory of her people. This made Camazotz, for the first time, flee from an opponent, making Nitocris a hero among the Danos who had never seen anyone chase Camazotz away before. After this first encounter, Camazotz became intrigued by Nitocris, listening in on her conversations, and so learning of her backstory. When they next met in the Fourth Underworld, Camazotz captured Nitocris and asked about her story. Why did she decide to undertake her quest for vengeance, only to judge that her vengeance was wrong, and so end her own life, without making any of the traditional preparations for a journey to the afterlife? No tomb, no rituals, nothing. To destroy herself before she could face the judgment of the Egyptian gods. It's a deep dive into Nitocris's character, that she is a fundamentally decent person, sought to correct a horrible injustice, but thought that, though it was for a good reason, she needed to be punished for what she had done, that the end did not justify the means. And while I've said how Nitocris's earlier story appearances were largely comedic, we still see her as a good-natured goofball who takes her position seriously. Her characterization has been consistent, but it is only now in Lostbelt 7 that we give Nitocris the depth that she deserves. After this, of course, came Nitocris's own questions about Camazotz, understanding what drove his behavior, and then turning the tables on him by getting Camazotz to make a bet that was a foregone conclusion. Then, taking knowledge acquired from his squeak, she turns herself into an altar, presenting her own heart to be judged by Anubis, setting aside her own sense of justice. Once done, she effectively becomes an avatar of the god Anubis, passing judgment upon Camazotz and forcing him to remember his past, allowing Chaldea to defeat him. While necessary to beat Camazotz, Nitocris effectively destroyed herself in the process, especially once she turned into an altar again to expose Tenochtitlan's true identity. After winning that battle, Nitocris vanished, with this version of her disappearing entirely, like what happened with Sanson during Salem. Nitocris can be resummoned to Chaldea, but she will no longer have the memories of her previous adventures there, though I'm sure she could learn about them by looking at the records, like how Tristan learned about how he was during Camelot. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So, to wrap all this up, Nitocris started out as a fun character with only a few hints towards her backstory. I can't say I blame the devs for this. The amount that we know about the historical Nitocris is tiny, barely enough to work with. I suspect she was added to Camelot so that Ozymandias wouldn't be the only Egyptian servant to appear there. But while she proved to be a very popular character, it took quite a while for fate to properly give Nitocris a moment in the sun. Thankfully, once Nitocris did get her moment, it was both very well done and very memorable. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Nitocris's depiction in Fate Grand Order? Well, her character design is quite good, making it obvious that she is meant to be a pharaoh. Her skill set, though, is more of a mixed bag. While I understand why the devs decided to give the historical Nitocris powers from her Lovecraft version, or tossing in other things like Medjed, to try to compensate for how little is known about her, they didn't need to do that. And they seem to know that since they gave her summer version a perfect historical MP. I think it would have been better if they had focused on the historical, or at least admitted that she was a blend of the historical and the Lovecraftian. As for characterization, Nitocris spent a long time being a fun secondary character that, though likable and always someone I was happy to see, she was never the focus. She was always a bit player attached to someone else's story. Lostbelt 7 finally gave Nitocris a moment to shine, and it was fantastic, digging into her past, her character, and making it a core part of the plot. It was only one small part of the story, but by giving Nitocris that moment in Lostbelt 7, the FGO writers finally gave one of its older characters the attention they deserved. And so for a final grade, I am going to give Nitocris, the Queen of Vengeance, a B-. If you would like to learn more about another noblewoman who is famous for taking revenge, check out my video on Kriemhild here. Also please like, subscribe, and come check out the streams during the weekend sometime. Currently getting viewers shot at by aliens in XCOM 2. Until next time.